common. It's if you look at the literature, which is mostly from kind of corporate um, America literature, about 20% of people are working in a toxic environment. So the question is, right, like, is it toxic? Is this just a really tough work environment? Are there different kinds of challenges we're facing, or is it truly toxic? And I'm just curious from all of you, have any of you actually felt like you've been in a toxic work environment? Tell me more. Reggie and then Landon.
Sometimes there will be people who are supervising you or leading the group that will really just push you past your limits. And there are times that you cannot say anything about it.
Hmm. Yeah, Landon?
Yeah, mine was very similar. It was a different boss, not Reggie. And he was just very abrasive and did not like listen to anybody below him, and it was just kind of like his word goes, and it was very frustrating.
Yeah, yeah. And I take it you didn't stay in that job since you're now with us. Yeah, and it's one of the main reasons that people actually leave a work environment. And so when we think about a toxic work environment, really what it is, it's an environment that is extremely harsh, malicious, or harmful. And like I said, toxic corporate culture is by far the leading cause of workplace attrition. Like most people don't really, if they have a choice, don't want to be working in those environments. They can be damaging, kind of to your physical health, mental health, as well as overall well-being. And so when we think about a toxic workplace, there's actually five dimensions that we can think about. So the first is toxic policies and procedures. Those are kind of things that are kind of embedded into kind of the group culture of usually of the organization. There can be a toxic culture. You can just have a toxic boss, which sounds like maybe Landon, that's what you had. Um, there can be toxic employees. I've definitely been in that situation. And less so in our field, there can be toxic customers. And like I said, most of the literature comes from corporate America, which is why they talk about customers a lot. So when we look at policies and procedure, these are like formal codified rules by which the company or organization operates, and that's when they're harmful. So working conditions that are unhealthy, right? If you have unhygienic labs, their temperature control is not regulated. It's either hot or cold. There's no privacy. It's backbreaking. Sometimes official working hours, break times, or scheduling systems don't leave us with any kind of control or ability to accommodate our needs, right? So if you have to leave early to do childcare, or you want to go to this event, or have time off to be able to participate in professional development. They may say so on paper, but then they don't actually allow people the ability to do that. There can be discriminatory hiring, performance management, or promotion practices that systematically disadvantage certain groups. And there also can be compensation and benefit programs that don't really provide a sustainable living. Right. So some of these examples are, quote unquote, advertised hours are 8 to 5. In reality, everybody's expected to work 8 to 8, every single day. Sometimes people are expected to work weekends. Again, there's no flexibility. I have heard of some labs where, PIs and or postdocs often get credit for others' work, or I heard one story where somebody's project was reassigned to a postdoc who needed to have some kind of was less productive, and so they had their project taken away from them and given to somebody else to promote that other person. And then, like I said, unsafe lab conditions. The next part that we think about is culture, right? So we can live in a toxic culture where the norms that dictate how people in our organization behave, and these are those unwritten rules by which people operate. Um, Often there's resistance to new people and rejection of ideas that disrupt the status quo. So if you're the new person on the team, your ideas are horrible, right? Why should we think you? Oh, that's weird. You shouldn't be thinking outside the box. We don't think like that, or we don't do that here. I don't know if any of you have experienced something like that. They have what they call zeros and heroes, where some people, whatever they say, have clout, and then others are ignored on a regular basis. There can be passive aggressive behaviors like gossip, undermining, or sarcasm. And this can be at the cultural level as well as kind of at the toxic employee level, where it's, oh, well, Reggie, blah, 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 Reggie, blah, 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 right behind Reggie's back. And then Reggie's like, I don't know why nobody likes me here. Um, there's a lot of office politics and opaque back channel influence strategies, relentless positivity and unwillingness to tolerate dissent or disagreement. And one of my work environments is very much kind of in this space where what some people, they say something, and everybody's like, oh, that's the greatest idea. But if you have any kind of a dissent, they think you're being harmful. Okay. There are other examples where, there's pressure to do whatever it takes to be productive. This can sometimes lead to people faking data because there is so much pressure to be productive. And it also some examples of like not allowing people to think outside the box. If you get some unexpected results, are we only thinking in this way versus being able to say, like, what are the other options that could be going on here? We can have toxic bosses, and that's when they have a difficulty prioritizing, and there's this constant pressure to deliver an unachievable workload. There's, multiple kinds of toxic bosses. There's the ones who say yes to everything, like, sure, my team can do that. Sure, my team can do that. And you're like, no, your team can't do that. That's not humanly possible. They can be harsh, critical, or dismissive judgments masquerading under the guise of feedback. Right. Let me offer you some feedback. Really, this sucks. You're sloppy, blah, 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 blah. Right. But it's more demeaning as opposed to truly constructive feedback. They often have double standards and inconsistent treatment between favorites and flops. There's sometimes poor planning that necessitates rework and firefighting. And then there can also be micromanagement and constant questioning and meddling in your work. So one of my colleagues has a toxic boss where it's, hey, we should do this. Like put together a plan for this program. Okay, we spend lots of time and energy putting together a plan for this program. And then, 2 weeks later, oh, let's try something else. Let's do this instead, right? So there's a lot of wasted time and energy putting together these plans and projects that never actually come to fruition because they're constantly doing rework. And then we can have toxic colleagues. And those are individuals, usually, hopefully not everybody, usually just one or two people on a team where they sometimes don't deliver on commitments and they affect your ability to meet expectations, right? So there's the ones that are kind of the backstabbers. There are ones that, always seem to not be actually doing the work that they're supposed to be doing, and that negatively impacts our ability to function. Sometimes they gossip about you with other colleagues or your manager. They can be harsh, disrespectful interactions where they're making snide remarks or personal attacks. And they may be overstepping with narcissistic save the day behavior that devalues your contributions. Like, oh, I know you can't do that, so I took care of it for you, and all of those are kind of subtly meant to demean you and diminish your value to the team. And again, we deal with this a little bit less in our world, but there can be toxic customers. You can imagine in corporate America, right? There can be abusive behavior, including yelling, unwanted physical contact, or aggressiveness. There are people who want to go around organizational policies. In the United States, we call these people Karens. Um, they might be nickel and diming for every single item with no respect for the value that they're getting. Oh, so those can be really tough environments. And what happens is that can lead to significant team dysfunction. And this is a model by Patrick Lencioni called The Five Dysfunctions of a Team. And basically, what it says is that in order to have a high functioning team, we need to have at the base, we need to have some level of trust. You can imagine in a toxic work environment that there is no trust because people are kind of intentionally sabotaging you as well as each other. What then happens is because there's no trust, there's typically a fear of conflict. And in this world, what I'm talking about is what we call productive conflict. So sometimes there may be conflict where people are kind of going at it, but it's not actually productive. It becomes conflict that is more kind of personal attacks as opposed to talking about the substance of the issue, where we're actually talking about the problems that we're trying to solve. Okay. Then what happens is because there's no conflict, people are saying, like, well, nobody heard my perspective on this. And so there ends up being a lack of commitment. Okay. I know our team decided on X, but they didn't really hear my opinion about, A, B, and C. And so, like, I'll shrug my shoulders and I'll say, okay, fine, we agreed to X. And I'll kind of half-heartedly move towards X, but not in a way that I truly care about. And then what happens is that then leads to lack of accountability and then lack of results. Okay. Because nobody really had buy-in at the beginning. And so that brings us to this concept of psychologic safety. How many of you have heard of this before? I see a few nods. Okay. Yeah, so psychologic safety is this concept. It's kind of getting at that base level of being able to have safety so that we can begin building trust. So it comes from the work of Amy Edmondson, and it's shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. Okay, so this means that people feel safe speaking up on their team. You can voice an unpopular opinion without fear of a colleague's rebuttal. And then you can actually disagree with your boss, knowing that they will value or at least tolerate your divergent thinking. Okay. When we think about psychologic safety, there are three different levels that we want to actually be thinking about. And the first one is truly lack of psychologic safety, and that is fear of harmful outcomes. So if you have direct evidence that people who disagree or rock the boat will be punished, that is psychologically unsafe, and that is actually toxic, right? If Arwa goes and says something, and then Arwa gets relegated to some back closet, for her work environment, or, gets the bad project, that is lack of psychologic safety. And that is different than fear of aversive outcomes. So sometimes people feel like they have a lack of psychological safety when really they're just feeling unsafe at the thought of ideas being tested or having to do additional work or having to shift long-held beliefs. Okay. And we see this a lot in our students when we talk about different kind of controversial ideas where they have long-held beliefs that things should be a certain way. And then they struggle sometimes with having conversations with people who have different opinions. And that is what we would call it as uncomfortable, not unsafe. And it's really important to differentiate that because uncomfortable is not toxic. Like if I have to have a conversation and say, this is why I believe A, B, or C. And somebody is, well, I believe D, E, and F. I have a difference of opinion, and we have an engagement conversation about that. That is not unsafe. Okay. That might be uncomfortable because I have to stand up for my values and kind of explain why I believe a certain thing. And then the last part is, this concept of not safe from yourself. So if you feel unsafe because you believe your team will stop liking you, if you don't go along with them, or you won't make your point perfectly eloquently, or you're worried about looking like less smart than your colleagues, then that is more of a self-confidence problem, imposter syndrome, but not a safety problem. So we just want to make sure we differentiate between these three levels. So you find yourself in a toxic environment. Okay, we don't have those levels of psychological safety. We don't necessarily have that level of trust, right? We're a very dysfunctional team. What are we going to do? So we actually have options. A lot of people, when they get into these situations, feel like they are stuck. Um, so people do have the choice of quitting the organization, and especially if it is truly a toxic organization embedded in those policies and procedures about how that whole institution works, you can consider quitting the organization. Often people feel like that's a very difficult thing to do. And in general, we encourage people to potentially have something lined up afterwards before leaving an organization, or trying to think about, are there any skills that I can gain before I leave the institution? The next option, rather than quitting the organization, is like, is it really the whole organization that is bad, or can we actually just quit our team? Maybe this particular group of people is particularly toxic, but we don't necessarily need to give up the entire organization. Could we switch to a different team or switch to a different right group of people who are working together so you're not as exposed to that toxic environment? The next thing to consider is maybe we should quit our role. Maybe it is this particular position that is placing us in that toxic environment, and maybe we just need to quit that role. We like to call it constructive redeployment. So then you constructively redeploy into something else that either better aligns with your skill set, better aligns with a work environment that is better for you. And then the last option is to stay in that role and try to do something about fixing this toxic environment. And there are two ways to do that. So you can either change the way you behave or the way that you think in the hopes of changing your experience of work. Okay, what does this mean? So sometimes people go in saying, like, well, I want my work environment to be like this. And if it's not like this, then it's not going to be perfect. And I think it's okay to not have a perfect work environment, but some of it is saying, like, you know what, I can deal with this. I'm just going to do my work and I'm going to try to network with some people so that it becomes less toxic of an environment. But maybe you stop having this kind of like pie in the sky ideal of what that work life should be. And sometimes it's setting the expectations for yourself that can also help that mind shift. And then if you choose to stay, what you can do is work on these different levels. So you can work at the self, you can work with teammates, colleagues, and then begin building social connections. Okay, and that helps manage working with a toxic boss. So you can start with yourself, right? A lot of it is questioning, like, am I overreacting? Okay, if you start to form a story that your boss doesn't like you, and you'll be looking for all the evidence to convince yourself that's true and ignoring evidence to the contrary, that's going to be confirmation bias. I personally got myself into this mindset a while ago. If my boss doesn't like me, you know, everything I say, they're going to dislike. And then I began realizing like it was mostly in my head. Um, and that my boss doesn't actually not like me. Okay. The next thing to do is to protect self-esteem. So you can reframe statements about you as statements about your behavior in one situation. So if you have somebody like a boss or a colleague who's basically labeling you as sloppy, instead of thinking to yourself, I'm sloppy, what you can think of is, I wrote a 3-page report and there were 2 typos. Okay, right? It's making it a little bit more concrete. And then it's saying, like, okay, well, I'm going to fix this. And then asking for some positive feedback. Okay, I know there were two typos in this report, but what else, what did I do well that I should continue doing? Okay, and that positive feedback can help with our self-esteem. It's also critically important to set clear boundaries. So if, most of the time work hours should be what, 8 to 5, then we should set those work hours 8 to 5. And it should be the rare exception rather than the rule that we are working beyond those, unless it's called for some reason, because like our experiment is a timed experiment or something like that. And then the other thing is document, document, document. So this means that you write down the facts. If somebody is harassing you or being harsh or whatever, you write it down, on June or January 5th, Reggie said this, blah, 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 blah. If you can remember the actual quotes, put that down. And so that way, if it does come to the point where we are needing to consider talking with human resources, we actually have something documented and it's not ideally, it's more about facts and not less about like emotions in that documentation. Next is looking at your teammates and assuming that your teammates are not those toxic employees, or you can kind of find the teammates that are not toxic. The team can sometimes try to manage a boss. Um, Right. So last week you said X was the priority. Now you're saying Y. We can't do both at the same time. So which is the priority? So this is the person who keeps changing their mind and you end up wasting a lot of time and energy chasing one thing after the other. Right. So sometimes in a team meeting, you can be like, okay, all three of us, we're going to agree that we're going to make sure that we clarify with the boss exactly what the priority is. And then we write it down in an email that says, okay, we had this conversation. This is what you said the priority was going to be. So this is what we're going to be working on. And then that way, right, when they come change their mind later, you can either try to manage the boss. Well, you said this is what we were working on. So that's what we're doing. Um, or you can get them to sometimes recognize that they're being kind of wishy-washy in what they're asking you to do. Sometimes you can work on communication that doesn't always include the boss. And it's not designed to exclude the boss per se, but you can become a self-managing team where it's like, okay, I think this is what we think is the priority. Let's go ahead and make this happen, and kind of circumvent having the boss be always kind of shifting in there. And then obviously looking for your team members for support and emotional support in that space. Okay. When we think about other colleagues, it's important to network and reconnect with former teammates or managers who may be working in other parts of the organization. It's important to share kind of what you're doing and make sure that like you have a broader network that is beyond your team. So you can share what's going on. You can also, you know, find that emotional support. And then if you do need to get to a point where you are looking for a different role, you're going to have some of those connections. And that's really what the goal is. And it's also, if your work world is not only with one team, it kind of spreads out kind of where that those pain points might be. And so you may have like joy in one area of your work, and it makes other parts of the work that are less kind of joyful seem a little bit more tolerable. And then social connections, it's important to build resilience, get lots of good sleep, build social connections where there's unconditional love and acceptance. We call this having 4 a.m. friends. So these are people who you could call up at 4 in the morning for no reason at all, and they would kind of pick up the phone and accept that. Ideally, some movement, aka exercise or walking, ideally outside, and then trying to eat some healthy foods. All right. And then I want to shift because working in a toxic environment can create often a lot of conflict. I do want to touch basically on managing conflict. And so when we think about conflict, we often think about fighting, headbutting, right? And really what it is a mental struggle resulting from incompatible or opposing needs, drives, wishes, or external or internal demands. How many of you love conflict? No, no. Yeah, often we think of conflict as, right, this tension, right? We have to pull against each other. But conflict isn't necessarily something that we have to struggle with in that way. It's really that tension. And if we can come to kind of a collaborative agreement like the donkeys do at the end of this comic, right, it can actually be quite productive. So I'm just curious, what conflicts are you currently facing in your work environments? So I'm sure if you think about it, there's probably some conflicts. Again, conflicts don't always have to be big in order for them to actually be conflicts. And so what we want to do is just briefly think about how do we have a tendency to manage conflict. And this is the Thomas Kilmann conflict mode. And basically, what it says is that we all have a tendency um, to manage conflict. You can go on that vertical axis, which is level of assertiveness, and then the horizontal axis is level of cooperativeness. And they divided kind of conflict styles into competing, collaborating, compromising, avoiding, and accommodating. And how we manage conflict can either make our toxic environment worse or better. So that's why I wanted to make sure we touched on conflict. So if we think about competing, competing we often think about as win-lose, where you are high assertive but not very cooperative. Okay, I get what I want. You don't necessarily get what you want. I win, you lose. And that's when my concerns or your own concerns are greater than those of others. It's when you are potentially standing up, you're defending yourself or your position, trying to win. And sometimes this can show up as a power play. Now, the thing about conflict styles is that they all have a time and a place where they can be very useful. So I'm curious, when do you think you might use a competing conflict style? So competing can be a good use when you need a quick decision. And sometimes, if life is on the line, right? I like to use the example of, as a physician, you know, when somebody is coding, this is not the time to have a collaborative conversation about who is going to be doing chest compressions, right? I am going to walk in the room and I'm going to say, you are going to do chest compressions and you are going to push this med and you are going to do that. And that would be considered a competing conflict style, okay? When it's something that's critically important and time is of the essence, right? The drawbacks of using competing or competing too much is that over time, people stop trusting you. I have a colleague who loves to compete just for the sake of competing, um, and does not know any other conflict style. And so very few people actually want to work with him anymore. Because again, he's always out there to kind of, even if it's not anything that you think is a big deal, he's out to win, regardless of what it is. And then people stop trusting him because he doesn't have any other style. And so when they try to give him an information to say like, hey, can we collaborate on this? He ends up using that information to, again, try to win. And so he doesn't, he's not very well liked. The next conflict style is avoiding. And this is when we are not assertive, and we're also not cooperative. Some people think of this as a win-lose. Some people think of this as lose-lose. Okay. Um, there are people who do this too much. Okay. We're not actually addressing the conflict. We're sidestepping, we're postponing, we're withdrawing from a threatening situation. And sometimes this is a good choice, right? If emotions are really high, you're not really sure what the next step is. It is sometimes okay to avoid the conflict for now. The problem is if you use it too much, you never actually solve anything because you're just like, oh, we'll talk about this later. Oh, right. It's not really a big deal. We're never gonna do blah 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 blah. And I don't know about you, but I have had bosses that live in avoiding world and nothing ever gets done, and it's extremely frustrating. Bad behavior never gets fixed. Um, we don't actually have good conversations about the issues at hand. Okay. The next strategy is accommodating. And accommodating is when we're high on cooperativeness, but we're also unassertive. So this is win-lose. We're usually the loser in this situation, okay, where you put others' needs above your own. So some people call it like self-sacrifice, charity, obeying, yielding. You can see this picture. It's of somebody like, please walk all over me, right? Type of graphic. Um, and accommodating is actually can be good, especially if it is something that is not that important to you, but may be important to the other person. It's a way of building what we call social capital, right? I'm going to give you what you need right now. Hopefully, that means you'll like me and you won't just take advantage of me. Um, and then later on, theoretically, if you have an ask, they're more likely to be able to, um, accommodate you at some other point in time. Again, the drawbacks of accommodating are that you can feel like people are walking all over you. You don't ever, if you live in accommodating world, you don't ever get what you want. So at some point in time, you do have to become more assertive if you actually want something. Um, but like I said, it can help build social capital. So, right, if you're on that toxic team, maybe you can build a friend on that team um, that will kind of be your support at some point in time. This next one is called compromising. It's intermediate assertiveness and intermediate in cooperativeness. So we would call this, some people say win-win, lose-lose. Um, Basically, what happens is both people give and both people get. So it's kind of that middle ground where you're splitting the difference. And it's, excuse me, minimally acceptable to all people involved. And theoretically, the relationship is undamaged. But you can see in this graphic where people get half an umbrella, it's not actually solving the problem. So sometimes we use compromising when we need a relatively quick solution. Say you have like a, a report or something that is due, or you have a grant that's due. Maybe it's not going to be the perfect solution to what you want to do. Um, but you need to do something because there's a deadline coming up. And so you can use this to kind of find that middle ground for everybody. The challenge is it never really completely solves the problem that you're trying to fix. Um, and like I said, everybody usually feels like they get a little bit of win, but they also mostly feel the lose part of it as well. All right. And then there is collaborating. Collaborating is high in cooperativeness and high in assertiveness. And theoretically, it's this win-win. It used to be touted as quote unquote the best conflict style. Um, in theory, it's when others' interests are as aligned with your interests in terms of assertiveness. And you're trying to identify the underlying issues and find alternatives that meet both needs. And you try to create creative solutions where you're actually thinking outside the box. Okay. It's like, help me understand what your basic needs are. And then when you use this style, it is really good for complex, challenging problems, which are most of the things that we face these days. The challenges with collaborating is it takes a really long time and it takes a lot of trust. So as I mentioned before with my colleague who loves to live in compete world, um, it only works if you can actually trust the other person to kind of show you their cards and say, like, this is really what I need. If they're going to just take those cards and then smack you over the head with it, that's not going to work. Okay. And collaborating, it does take a long time. And so that is why it is also not necessarily the perfect solution, but definitely one of the opportunities. All right. And so the other thing that you want to think about is when you're going into a conflict is what is it that you actually want? Right? Often we wade into a conflict, right? Saying like, "Oh, I just want so and so to not be a jerk. I want my boss to stop being toxic." Okay? But specifically, what behavior are you wanting to communicate? Like, what is the one most important thing that you want to happen? And you really need to plan what you are going to say, right? Because most people don't react well to just stop being a jerk, okay? Because they're like, I'm not being a jerk, I'm just being me. And so what you need to say is like, right, when you do this, this makes me feel very uncomfortable. Can you do this instead? Okay. You want to be very specific about what results do you really want. And it may be like incremental. You're not going to fix a toxic environment overnight. It may be, I just need you to stop interrupting me, right? The next time we're in a conversation, um, I need you to count to five before you say anything. So you stop interrupting me because it drives me bonkers. If you need more information, make sure you get it, right? The last time we had a conversation, you interrupted me 20 times. Okay. You also want to be thinking about where you should meet. And I know it sounds kind of silly, but if you're meeting in somebody else's office, that means that they have the power in that situation. And it may make more sense to meet potentially in a public space, in the middle of the lab, or someplace that's a little bit more neutral. And then the other thing is to think about when should the meeting take place? When do you have the most cognitive power and energy, right? If you are an introvert and you have to spend all day talking to people, probably at the end of the day when you're exhausted is probably not the best time to have a meeting. Or, if you're a morning person, you may want to do mornings rather than evenings. Okay. And then what we want to also do is think about emotionally intelligent conflict, right? So emotional intelligence um, is both recognizing and regulating kind of your own personal emotions and then other social um, competence as well, right? So we have to recognize, you know, our own state, emotional state, right? Like if I go into a conflict and I'm mad or I'm upset because I was nearly in a car accident, right? And I'm super stressed out and it has nothing to do with anything, right? I am not necessarily going to be regulating my emotions or my ability to manage that conflict conversation as well as I could. So I need to know where I'm at and then I need to regulate it. It's also knowing what those triggers are for you, right? Like I personally, as you can tell, probably interruptions drive me bonkers. Okay, to me, they feel like disrespect. And I also know that for a lot of people, interruptions are how they are getting excited about a conversation. And so I have to kind of manage that piece of it, um, and learn how to change and adjust flexibly, so that, right, I'm not like flying off the handle every time somebody interrupts. Or, is it like anytime somebody says something and it starts to get at like my imposter syndrome, or I feel like they're doubting my competence. All of these things might be triggers, and I might need to be aware of that so I can kind of take a deep breath and manage that emotion before I kind of launch into kind of the next step of the conversation. The other part is that social awareness. So you need to understand what is going on in the room, um, and care about what other people on your team are going through, right? I imagine if they're in a toxic environment, with you, that they may be having their own struggles in different ways, and there's a way to build empathy, um, in that kind of environment without necessarily bad mouthing other people. And then you want to make sure manage those relationships, get along with others, clearly express ideas, and try to understand how they are feeling, right? Wow, that was a really, tough meeting for me. How are you feeling about that? Right, that begins to build some empathy, um, and can help with that kind of more team formation and coherence. Do, 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 do. All right. And then we want to make sure we can regulate, um, our and control our emotions, right? We don't want to be run by our emotions, but we are emotional beings. And we want to understand that some people believe that negative emotions shouldn't happen, right? Some people don't like negative emotions. Um, they are part of who we are. There are stressful situations in our past experiences, right? If we've been in a toxic environment before, some of us carry some of those scars, from those, past experiences, and it might be more likely to kind of set off a trigger, if something happens that reminds us of that previous environment. Okay. And so trying to figure out how can we manage ourselves? Like, what are our triggers? What emotions come up for you when that happens? How do you feel physically? Right? Often it's hard for us to recognize our emotions, but sometimes what we can do is we can feel like, oh, our pulse is getting up, or I'm getting sweaty, um, or, right, like I'm feeling much more jittery than I used to. And then trying to figure out how are we going to manage those. And there are ways to help us regulate so we can create space, right? Sometimes it's just pausing and taking a deep breath, noticing what you feel, being curious about your emotions as well as your physical reactions, naming what you feel, and then begin to unpack it. Like, what is the story you might be telling yourself about this particular situation or the environment? Accept that emotion. Remember, we are all human, and we want to practice self-compassion, and then practice mindfulness by paying attention to what we're experiencing in a non-judgmental way, and then trying to act on our values. So choose a response that aligns with our values. Okay. And just as a reminder, there's a whole wide range of emotions that are out there. Often we're not very good, um, at using these emotion words, and I'm not saying we have to memorize all of these, but we have a tendency to remember angry and sad, a lot. But there's this whole wide range of emotions that we can all experience. And then when we want to think about managing others, the what we want to do is recognize, is there silence or violence, okay, when we're in conversation. Okay, if there's silence, That's when action is taken to refrain from sharing your perspective. So that can be withdrawing, masking, or avoiding. Sometimes people will change the subject, accommodating. Sometimes those passive aggressive comments or kind of ignoring people. And then violence is action taken to compel others towards your point of view. And that can be attacking, labeling, controlling, talking over others, name calling, interruptions, or raising your voice. Okay. And these are both forms, obviously, of ineffective communication that it would be important to recognize if somebody suddenly shifts, you can be like, hey, wait a minute, something happened here in this conversation. Okay, because we also don't want to be those toxic employees ourselves. Okay. And then again, rolling with resistance, right? Remembering that when somebody is pushing back against us, it could be that we're moving too fast or we've failed to understand something critically important that it to them. If they're pushing back against us, meet it with reflection rather than confrontation, right? I noticed, you've kind of withdrawn and you've stopped talking or sharing your perspective. I'm curious what's going on there for you. Um, right? Your intent is not necessarily to take sides, but that you're seeking understanding of their point of view. Help me understand what your perspective is. I think I missed something. Can you help me understand this a little bit better? Okay. Any kinds of arguments, confrontation, fear tactics, etc., actually increase resistance, and so we do not recommend that. All right. And finally, we all have a role that we can play in recognizing and managing a toxic workplace. So we know that effective teamwork begins with psychological safety and productive conflict. Oh, a couple typos. Sorry about that. Um, and that we also, if we can effectively manage some of these conversations and this conflict, we can begin creating kind of a safer and less toxic work environment for ourselves as well as for our colleagues. And so with that, I will stop sharing and see if there's any thoughts, questions, comments.
All right. I don't see anything in the chat either, Rita. Well, thank you so much for powering
Thank you.
through. I
Yeah,
hope your cold gets better.
thank you.
For those who logged in to the COMMeND webinar for the first time, Rita is our expert in terms of content for cross-cultural training, and she's been a really great co-investigator in the R25 that is funded by the NIDCD for this program. So thanks again, Rita. We're sending our applause. Yeah. All right. We'll proceed now with the otitis media content. First up will be Professor Peter Santamaria. Peter is a professor and chief of otology and urology and vice chair of translational and clinical research at the University of Pittsburgh Otolaryngology Department, with a research program focused on improving hearing outcomes through regenerative therapeutics, advanced diagnostics, and novel medical devices. His work includes studying sensory loss in chronic otitis media, part of his topic today, advancing tympanic membrane regeneration strategies, and leading clinical and translational development of earflow, a non-invasive device for middle ear ventilation. Thank you so much for joining us, Peter. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Reggie. Let me just share my screen there. Whoops. Get in. Okay. I think we're good. Are we good? Great. Thanks, Sarah. Thumbs up. My talk this morning is more of a journey of some of the research that I've been doing, and also to give people some background about why I'm interested in otitis media. And also to maybe give a high level of a lot of the things that I'm doing in otitis media rather than doing any deep dive. And I gave a webinar a little while ago to the same group, which was more of a deep dive in some of the research. So this is more of the highlights. So please, if anyone has any questions or want to interrupt me, please do. It's not supposed to be a formal talk. And really just highlights my journey from Perth, Western Australia to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So I also sometimes have to pinch myself to think about how I got here. So part of this is describing that journey. So for those of you that are not familiar, this is where Perth, Western Australia is. I was actually just there for Christmas, and yes, it did look exactly like this. So it was 107 on Christmas Day, and so it was nice and hot. Now I'm back into the snow, so it's a big change. But I did all my training in Western Australia, and there we have a really good program where if you extend your residency training by 3 years and spend that time in the lab and then integrate your residency training with the lab, they integrate a PhD as part of that. So I did my PhD very late, which is also very good because I had it very late into my training. I think one of the issues that sometimes when you do it here in the States is you do it in medical school and then you have a gap with residency and you don't really see that research for a while. Whereas I was very fortunate to be able to choose something that was very close to what I thought was interesting clinically and scientifically, and then went on to a fellowship which I was able to combine with my research at the same time. So having that late exposure was really important to me. And why do I care about otitis media was because a lot of my training involved traveling around Western Australia. We would get on the plane from Perth, which is down the bottom left. We would travel to Port Hedland, which would take about 4 hours. Then we would travel another 3 hours to the center of the country to do a lot of clinics. And that's kind of the equivalent of flying from San Diego to Montana for a clinic. And so, if you use the Pittsburgh analogy, it's going from Pittsburgh to Albuquerque for an ear clinic. So, Australia is a big country like the US, except we're expected to cover very vast distances and provide care. And it's kind of the tale of two countries where you kind of notice all the beautiful beaches and the Mediterranean climate of the south, whereas up north it's a very different dry climate. And also, we're a very fortunate country with a lot of medical services, but they have trouble reaching the internal of the country, and it's very much a lot of third world that we see there. And most of the people in otitis media here are very familiar with the Australian Aboriginal population that have the highest incidence of chronic otitis media. And we would do clinics with kids, and we would see maybe 100 kids in the morning, and we had to see so many children that we barely talked to them. We were just looking in the ear, and we usually saw one of these three pictures, which all of you are familiar with: chronic otitis media effusion, dry tympanic membrane perforation, or chronic suppurative otitis media. And it was almost universal, and the incidence or the prevalence is actually closer to about 50% of the population there. So it really is a burden, and so it was sort of burnt into my memory that how significant this was. It was also really significant to see that the Australian Aboriginal population often had a quality of life that was much less than the people that live in the cities. They had a lifespan that was often 15 or 20 years less. And this otitis media was not just inconvenient, but it was a huge burden that those that affected it really set up their trajectory to be different than everyone else. So for me, it was like I really became committed to treating this clinically, as well as became interested in what we could do in the scientific areas for this. And then I was kind of happy to land in Pittsburgh, where many of you know that there's a lot of pioneers in otitis media research here, and to continue the legacy that is ongoing here in Pittsburgh. And so when I look at otitis media, there's a number of things that I'm doing in the areas, and they're all, for me, it's a lot. I have a lot of fun. I have a lot of things that are interesting scientifically, and some of them are really, really different from each other. So I'm going to highlight them in different aspects. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is what we're doing with otitis media with effusion. So everyone here is familiar that otitis media with effusion is the consequence of acute otitis media. And we understand that part of that pathogenesis is eustachian tube or dilated eustachian tube dysfunction, which we explain to patients as having fluid in the ear. Because that fluid in the ear doesn't resolve, the main thing that it leads to in children is hearing loss, of course. And if that hearing loss persists, it can cause language delay, developmental delay, and falling behind in school. There's not much, there's a lot of harm that can be done with kids with this. And, this leads to the number one procedure that we do in the States, which is putting in tubes. It's really described as we know, as almost being a hazard of childhood, with 90% having this before the age of 5. And if we let it go, it can really affect populations in terms of quality of life, social and economic development for kids and their families. It's a very straightforward surgery that we do. So the clinicians in the audience will know that we put tubes in for this, which is really just putting a ventilation tube between the middle ear and the external ear, allowing drainage of that and allowing air to get in, which is really a bypass of the eustachian tube. And we put that tube in, and hopefully the underlying condition will resolve, or the child grows out of the eustachian tube dysfunction by late childhood. But parents and even though it's a simple procedure, don't want necessarily to put their kids through surgery. And ear tubes can become infected, they can fall out. And I have to say, as an adult ear surgeon, most of the problems that I see, like cholesteatoma and adult chronic otitis media, all start from having chronic otitis media as a child. So, tubes aren't necessarily benign in themselves, and they do undergo a large surgical cost. Oh, I just wanted to show this news. Hopefully the volume is okay, but show this news from Perth, Western Australia. So, we call in Australia and in the UK, we call ear tubes grommets. So that's what that is. And you can see the situation is so dire in a lot of public health systems where, I mean, she was waiting 14 months. I think in Perth, it's more like 2 years to see an ENT. And in that time, they're given bone conduction hearing aids and other things to help them not fall behind. So it's even in like very sophisticated systems, we think the UPMC system is great. It's still very hard to get in to see pediatric ENTs. And so there is a lot of delay there. And, children are falling behind during this work. So one of the things that I had been working on with a team of engineers in Perth that actually came to spend time with us at Stanford Biodesign when I was there a few years ago, was developing a non-invasive device for opening the eustachian tube of kids. We were able to hide this within a cup within a child. And I'll just show you how that works in a little bit. But it's actually really exciting that it's won a number of awards, and it's currently going through the FDA at the moment. We expect it to be approved this week or any week now in January, and to be on the market. So I think another Pittsburgh news story will explain how it works. And I won't play the older video, but you can hopefully see from the pictures.
It was named one of Time Magazine's 100 best
Yes, it's working.
The airflow device is a sippy cup, but it's designed to do a lot more than hold your kid's favorite drink. It was created to help prevent hearing loss, reduce pain and discomfort, alleviate behavioral and sleep problems, minimize developmental delays, avoid surgery complications and costs. So what is it, and how does it work? One of the inventors, Dr. Peter Santamaria, is based right here in Pittsburgh, and he met with Pittsburgh's Action News 4 anchor Eleanor LaQuatra to explain this.
Your kids sipping their favorite drink from this cup could prevent a wide array of issues that all connect back to fluid buildup in the ear.
It seems so benign, but it actually really does impact childhood development, speech and learning and things like that at a critical period when they're learning language. So,
Dr. Peter Santamaria, an ENT within the Department of Otolaryngology at UPMC, has been developing this medical device with a team of specialists for the last 7 years. It is called the EarFlow, and it's a eustachian tube opening device disguised as a sippy cup. Many kids often get otitis media with effusion, also known as glue ear. That's a condition where fluid accumulates in the middle ear behind the eardrum. It can happen from an upper respiratory infection, allergies, enlarged adenoids. It often results in what Dr. Santamaria calls chronic ear infections.
So pediatricians, sometimes they get better, so they'll just watch and wait it out. But other times they'll refer it to see a pediatric ENT surgeon to have tubes put in. So putting tubes in ears is the #1 procedure that we do in the United States.
Dr. Santamaria says he wishes he was doing less of these surgeries.
As a parent myself, I was really reluctant to recommend tubes for my kids. Even though it's a very simple procedure, we're all a little bit afraid of putting our kids through surgical procedures.
So how does this device work, and how could a cup possibly take the place of a surgery? Well, it's designed like a child's cup, so they'll drink from a mouthpiece, and as they do, there's also a soft nose piece on the cup that will gently sit on their nostrils.
It'll sense when the child is drinking, and it does that by detecting when the palate is closed. So when the child drinks, the palate at the back will close, and it'll give a little puff of nasal air. And when the palate's closed, that puff of air will go into the eustachian tube. And it's about 1 psi, so it's very gentle. The children don't notice it because it's timed with swallowing.
That gentle puff of air displaces the fluid sitting in the middle ear that causes all the problems. Now, it's designed for kiddos as young as 2, so you might be thinking there's no way I could trick my young child into drinking from an unfamiliar cup. But the inventors considered that when creating this device, connecting the cup via Bluetooth to a mobile app on a cell phone.
Parents, want to help train their child, and so when the child is drinking from that and they're not quite doing it, they don't really get the reward. But if they're doing it right, they'll get the rocket and the star. So you can actually train your child to do it with the app, and you can track how many treatments they're getting. You can track it on the dashboard. The children can collect little monsters and stars. So it's actually quite cool because the children love to do it. For me, I look at it, it's just something that's really simple, and if it could just maybe prevent a few kids getting hearing loss, it would be worthwhile.
Amazing technology. That was Elna LaQuatra reporting.
I was just going to stop there. And so, the mechanism of polymerization is centuries old. So it's not a new mechanism. And there's other devices there that open the eustachian tube, but I think trying to hide it in a way that can be used by young children, otitis media, chronic otitis media has a peak incidence of less than 4 years. So trying to get it in a way that kids can do it. So we've done some clinical studies already. We've done 2, and in those studies of about 25 and another 30 patients, we've been able to prevent kids going on to have surgery in about 90% of the time. So, it doesn't do anything to affect the underlying pathogenesis of the disease, but it might be a stopgap at the end to prevent kids going through to surgery. So I just wanted to highlight there that there's different ways to tackle the same issue. The other area that I worked on in the past has been looking at wound healing, which was my area of PhD research, was understanding how the tympanic membrane wound healed. So in the past, we'd also come up with a regenerative therapy, which was designed to try and avoid surgery as well. So, tympanoplasty is a surgical repair of the eardrum, where we usually take a bit of cartilage or fascia from behind the ear and insert it into the drum. Works about 90% of the time, but we do almost 200,000 surgeries a year, and it requires an admission to hospital. Something that is currently in phase 2 clinical trial was repurposing HBEGF, which is heparin binding epidermal growth factor, like growth factor. And this is just an example of instilling that in the ear canal. It's a thermoreversible gel to put it in there. It's currently at the stage now where we went through phase 1 and phase 2. We found it was safe, but the formulation wasn't sticky enough. So we're currently looking to redesign the formulation before going back into clinical trials. And that was something that's also exciting that our lab is working on. The other third area, which is kind of our main passion and area of funded research at the moment, is looking at chronic suppurative otitis media. And it's to do with this problem that we often take swabs from the ear. We might grow something or not. But despite the fact that we only have one targeted antibiotic, which is a fluoroquinolone to treat it with, and even though that they particularly seem to be susceptible, if we go by antibiotic resistance, we know that long-term studies are very effective in converting these infections to being inactive in the short term, but we know as clinicians, and if you look at it in the long term, that they have a lot of relapse. And this part of the research that we did was describing this relapse. So this kind of shows you what happens if you do get medical treatment with chronic suppurative otitis media, that 50% of patients will relapse within 4 months, and most of them by 12 months. If you look at surgery, it kind of pushes that relapse rate out to 3 to 5 years, but it's still abysmal for a disease. So, the best medical therapy that we currently have leads to more than 50% relapse within 1 year. And this began a global collaboration. So we do collect a lot of chronic suppurative otitis media samples. We currently have about 150 samples. If anyone from different institutions that's listening wants to contribute to that, we'd love to collaborate with you. But a lot of the knowledge that we're working on is based on this clinical library that we've been able to create. And what we've learned is that one of the largest reasons why infections don't seem to get better is this concept of persister cells. So what happens when antibiotics are treated in the middle ear is that the antibiotic comes in, they usually find their target, and they usually act on those cells that are sensitive and kill them. With the majority of ear infections, the bugs are actually sensitive. They're not resistant at first. What then happens is that there's a very small population, it's often in the 0.001% of the bacterial population, that is dormant. And because antibiotics use metabolic mechanisms to kill, when they're dormant, the antibiotic mechanism is not present. And so those persistent cells survive until the antibiotic degrades, and then they proliferate. What can happen over time is that mutations can occur in those persistent cells where then you secondarily get a infection that is both persistent and resistant. And what that looks like clinically is that these patients stop responding. So you might treat them at first with fluoroquinolones and they get better and then they come back, whereas now you treat them with fluoroquinolones and they don't even get better in the first place. And what that kind of is as a basic mechanism is what I've described there, is that the antibiotic mechanism needs a binding site. And usually that is a metabolic mechanism. And if that binding site exists, then there will be death of that cell. But when there's resistance, the main form of resistance is these efflux pumps. So the bacteria just typically spits out these drugs as they're taken into the cell. The second form of resistance is a modification of the target site, where you usually need to have more and more drug to overcome that binding. And that's where you get an increase in that. The concept of persistence is different to that, because the bacteria are kind of asleep. There is no binding site, so they just come in. There's no target, and then they survive through that. And so also in persistent cells, there are often secondary mechanisms of antibiotics. So you can have micro damage of that cell, but because they're persistent and they have a long time, they do have time to repair. So there's two ways that persistent cells tend to survive an antibiotic attack. What that looks like is that you need more antibiotics to overcome resistance. And then when you measure that, the minimum inhibitory concentration seems to get up. So when you send those bugs to the lab, you can measure higher MIC. The difference with persistence is if they awaken, and usually we just do that with a food source in the lab, then we measure the MIC, because the binding site has now appeared, and we measure the MIC, it actually is unchanged. So the difference between resistance and persistence is that the MIC elevates, and that's what defines resistance versus persistence. So a lot of our other research is looking at how we can best treat this at the moment. And as you can imagine, we do have very limited treatment options. A summary of that current research is that if you use fluoroquinolones, over time, because you don't kill the cells, you actually drive resistance. So we're actually promoting the antiseptic betadine a lot in the treatment of chronic suppurative otitis media. Funnily enough, that's what I used to treat when we used to go to the rural clinics in Australia. We used to treat these Indigenous kids with betadine. But that is at least one way of treating these potentially persistent cells. However, it does not lead to resistance. The problem with betadine is, as people might see, is that it has very poor intracellular penetration. It is toxic at certain levels and probably ototoxic at certain levels. So you have to be very careful when using it. And on the bottom right, it's just showing our animal model that we work with, showing that if that there was a relapse after treating with betadine. So, and I think this is limited to pharmacokinetics as well as poor intracellular penetration. We are working on some ways to kill these intracellular persistent cells. I've left two references there that people can read about if they're interested. I'm not going to go into details of that because it'll take a lot of time, but this is potentially hope on the horizon to kill antibacterial persistent cells. Our last area of focus is looking at why patients lose hearing during chronic suppurative otitis media. And a lot of this work is led by myself and Ann Ping. And we work in this model, which we've published here, if people want to also look at that model for use of themselves. And this model is cool because it's also works with a persister cell model of Pseudomonas. And in our first generation of the model, we used bioluminescent bacteria, so we could also track the disease. And what we found, and on the bottom left there, is showing that there was hair cell loss, predominantly outer hair cell, and in the base in mice that had chronic suppurative otitis media. And this did fit with what we saw in the humans, where they predominantly lost high-frequency hearing at first. We then went on to found that this was macrophage associated, that the macrophages themselves were timed with the death of these hair cells. And we were able to do various experiments of using inhibitors of macrophages to show that we could preserve hair cells in chronic suppurative otitis media, which led us to believe that macrophages themselves were the cause of outer hair cell loss in chronic suppurative otitis media. What we then went on to further is to see if we could specifically look at the mechanism. So we did a number of experiments, and the summary was that if we knocked out NLRP3, which is an inflammatory process within macrophages predominantly, that we could nearly preserve all hearing loss in chronic suppurative otitis media. We were able to specifically also use inhibitors, which I'm not showing in here, as well to prevent that. So this gave us hope that there potentially could be treatments to prevent hearing loss in chronic suppurative otitis media. And what this also showed was that this was an immune-mediated inner ear mechanism where the macrophages were potentially overactive through this inflammasome that caused hearing loss through being driven through these inflammatory markers. We've done a lot of follow-on studies to look at what was being in the middle ear that was driving the macrophages to do so. We're about to publish on that, but it's a multitude of factors from the middle ear that are driving this. Not bacteria themselves, as previously thought. And I'm just going to skip through that in the interest of time and finish there, and just open the floor for questions. And just thank you, everyone, and for letting me present my quick overview of what I'm doing in otitis media and why I'm passionate about it.
That was fantastic, Peter. Congratulations on the airflow. And I hope that HBEGF also works.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. We're having a lot of fun, as you can see.
Yeah. I have a quick question about HBEGF, if you will allow it.
Yes.
So I think in the previous study from Allen and Arwa, they showed that HBEGF knockout, I believe, causes mucosal hyperplasia. So how does that work for tympanic membrane regeneration without affecting the middle ear mucosa?
I think it probably does cause a little bit of hyperplasia temporarily. at least in the in the mouse model, we did see that, but it was transient during the time of repair, and seemed to go away once, we looked at them 6 months later, and there was no evidence that that was there. I think HBGF is just a driver of many things, and I think the underlying mechanism is through EGFR at the tympanic progenitors around the malleus. Certainly when we did the clinical studies in humans, there was a few patients that would get a little bit of like otorrhea or a little bit of like, I guess, itchiness or what was described as inflammation, but that was also transient around the time. So it might be driving something in the short term. Certainly because the formulation was so bad in the clinical trial, it was all getting into the middle ear. So we definitely got a very large middle ear exposure. So we definitely got feedback on what it was doing there. There didn't seem to be any long-term difference to that. It was all seemed to be transient. So I'm hoping that any effect it has on the middle ear mucosa is transient in the long term. And again, it's also probably transient to the tympanic membrane. It's also active enough that it could repair that enough and then have no long-term activity. But of course, we don't know because we haven't studied that yet.
Go ahead, Abby.
Hi, Peter. That was great. Thanks very much. And I was wondering just about whether you've done any sort of comparative studies with FGFs, because there's various, trials using FGFs, and I imagine there's generally a similar pathway involved. So yeah, that was my
That's a great question, Abby, and I think I did definitely skipped all of the science in that because I've talked on that in the past. I didn't want to put into that. That was really interesting. So the short answer is yes. It was also required. So there's a long story that I give about when we went out to get funding for taking it into the clinic, and a lot of the VCs and things like that wanted to see that comparative study. So we did that. Our original model was using an inhibitor of the tympanic membrane. It was a small molecule that you placed on gel foam and placed it into the middle. And if you did that for 7 days, it would stop the wound healing in the tympanic membrane. So we used that as the base. We also did other models where we put Pseudomonas into the middle ear, and we also did transcervical procedures on the mice and blocked off the eustachian tube. So like 3 different models of that. And we went head to head with EGF and FGF2 in that. And FGF2 and EGF didn't have any different results from the placebos. So luckily enough, we had about sort of 85% wound healing with EGF and about a 30% placebo wound healing rate with FGF2, EGF, and the control vehicle. So that was what kind of led to the confidence to kind of take it forward from there. I am pretty critical of a lot of the FGF2 literature and the tympanic membrane wound healing literature in general. I think one of the issues is that a lot of the work is done in acute wound healing models. And when you have acute wound healing, that would give a treatment in one arm and the control in the other. And the treatment would heal within 4 days and the control would heal within 8 to 10. And it's like, well, that's not really the real problem. We're not really trying to accelerate wound healing in the human. We're trying to kickstart something that was chronically not going to heal anyway. And so I think that's where a lot of the clinical applications have gone in FGF2 is looking at applications in acute wound healing models. So a lot of the clinical research is like, well, we get these fresh perforations. We're going to treat them with a control and these others, and often the FGF2s heal faster or more. But I don't think that reflects the chronic situation. The Mass Eye group did a human clinical trial. It was a really good trial, and it was randomized controlled placebo, but it was published in a journal which I think it was very difficult to find. So I guess a lot of people didn't see it, which is a pity because it was a great study. But it showed that again, when it went through the RCT, that the FGF2 treatment group didn't heal any better than placebo in the human population. One of the things that a lot of the FGF2 groups had to do as well is they had to do what's called freshening the perforation, where they get a little needle and scratch out the wound, which if you have to do that, you're almost doing a surgical procedure. And some of the other FGF2 trials needed to do 3 or 4 treatments to kids to get the wound healing rate up. And then if you're doing 3 or 4 procedures, why don't you just do one other procedure? So it's a little colored, which is why I'm so critical of it. But it definitely, I think there's probably other things that could be used as well.
Yeah. Okay, lovely. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you. We'll proceed with Mood's lecture. Mood, if you want to bring up your slides. And thanks again, Peter, if you can stay around a little bit for a few minutes of discussion after Mood's thought, that will be perfect. All right, I'll introduce Professor Mahmood Bhutta. He is an inaugural professor in ENT at Brighton and Sussex Medical School in the UK. He has a clinical and academic interest in ear and hearing care in low-resource settings, and in particular, models for management of chronic suppurative otitis media. He is honorary consultant to the World Health Organization Program for Prevention of Deafness and Hearing Loss, and was the recipient of the 2024 Nikhil J. Bhatt International Humanitarian Award by the American Academy of Otolaryngology and Head and Neck Surgery, and the 2024 President's Medal of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow. This is news to me, Mood. Thank you so much for joining us, and congratulations.
Thanks very much, Reggie. Yeah,
Yeah,
you can hear
there
me
you
now.
go.
Sorry. Yeah, I was muted. Thanks.
Yes.
So I think I was asked to speak a little bit about sort of career opportunities and things like that, rather than necessarily my research, same as Peter. So that's what I'm going to sort of just talk about, some ideas and how I've sort of transgressed the wide boundaries of otitis media research, really. I think I already gave a talk last year about some of my work in global ear disease, so I think that's already available. So I'm going to not try not to do that again. Thank you. So for me, working in the space of otitis media and particularly chronic otitis media, that sort of chronic inflammation, I've put it on this chart. You can go from, molecular science through to trials, through to sort of reviews of evidence, treatment, surgical, for example, but it doesn't have to be surgical, of course, through to the other end of service delivery. And I've kind of ended up somehow dabbling in a bit of all of this, really. And so I was going to just talk about my journey. I'm conscious that people don't really necessarily want to hear about everything I've done and hearing about my CV, but I will go through a few things and hopefully there will be some sort of generalizable things. So I suppose the idea is we can divide this into science in terms of, discovery, research, trials, reviews, etc., through to sort of clinical delivery of care. And Peter's already pointed out some of the work he's done previously, for example, the Aboriginal populations. I've also previously worked in Australia. But the real fun is when you try and bring both of those things together. And it doesn't matter which end you're on. The idea is actually, can we actually affect patient care? And I suppose one sort of starting point would be to say those who are clinical, actually, most of us understand very little about science. I've sort of delved into it. So if you are coming from a science background, you have a lot of value to the clinical people, and vice versa. I think scientific people who are purely scientific are really, well, you do well to link in with clinical people. So it gives you much greater depth of understanding of what the diseases may be, but also how you might translate your findings to real world applications. And I think it's that nexus that's really exciting. Like Peter, I'm clinical, so I've actually, got a bit of dabbling in both. But I would say that I started really purely as a surgeon and, dealing with the sorts of disorders that Peter has already outlined. Certainly in terms of chronic otitis media, we're talking about glue ear and insertion, for example, of grommets as a surgical treatment for that. Tympanic perforations, you've got in the middle there, and again, surgical repair, and then cholesteatoma, where we've got obviously the epithelium of the ear growing inwards, and that really requires surgical care. I was from a clinical background, and what I'm going to say is that repeatedly, it's really opportunities that have arisen that you can seize that really has helped me in my career. And I was on a training program. I just joined a training program, but someone told me about an opportunity to undertake a PhD, and I wasn't absolutely sure that that was what I wanted to do. That the research career is what I was intending, but obviously, it's worked out for me because that's what I do now. My job is actually 50% research and 50% clinical. And so I started completely at the other end with molecular science, and that's where my work has been. And indeed, Reggie, you'll be aware that, of course, we have collaborated on some ideas around genetics. And so my PhD started in genetics, and it was offered to me when I joined the training program for surgery in the Oxford region of the UK. And they just had a link with a genetics laboratory there, and they were investigating mouse models of chronic otitis media. And so on the back of that, I decided I did want to do it, and that was because I was quite interested in genetics and because I was quite interested in chronic middle ear inflammation. It worked out quite well, and so I think one of the general principles that I've put forward is it's good to sort of when you're entering into an area to critically evaluate what's already been done, and I do mean critically evaluate, not just describe, and then say what you are adding. And so this is kind of what I ended up doing with a large-scale genetics study undertaken in Oxford. We created several thousand individuals affected particularly by glue ear, that form of chronic otitis media. But you can see one of the early papers I published was actually a review where we actually critically criticized some of the existing studies in a scientific manner, of course, and then a large-scale study and reported on that. That's kind of the approach we've taken. So that was really an opportunity. I don't know why. Someone saw some potential in me and sort of suggested this as a PhD opportunity, and I did manage to get the funding to do it. And then I suppose the other thing is once you've sort of developed some expertise in the area, and that is through being scientifically robust, through being politely critical, we're all scientists, and so scientists like critique. We should all be open to that. It hopefully gives you the ability to move on to sort of review papers where you may hopefully write a review in the area, and that's what I ended up doing just after my PhD. Obviously, I published several other papers as well. I'm not going to go through all of them, but that was a review paper on the biology of chronic otitis media, and in fact, I quoted some of Peter's papers as well in this area. So that is what I would say. That is also not just an opportunity to say, hey, look, I've been asked to write a review paper, but to actually critically evaluate what is missing. What do we not understand here? And it's an opportunity to write down, this is what's a piece of information that's missing. That is then hopefully what you are then going to next investigate because you've written down and published in peer-reviewed journal. This is the missing piece of the picture, and therefore your next grant application and your next research is about trying to fill in that gap in understanding. Having done all that, I was at a little bit of a sort of crossroads in my career because I needed to finish my surgical training. But I did continue to work a bit in the background on research, but it also became an opportunity. And again, this is just by chance, by people who happen to be around. And I seized an opportunity because I was made aware of the possibility of working out in Cambodia, where they were setting up ear services. So this was a different form of otitis media. I previously worked on glue ear. This was about suppurative otitis media, holes in the eardrums, the cholesteatoma, very, very prevalent in low resource settings as much as it is in Aboriginal settings. And I was told there was nobody in Cambodia that could perform this surgery, and they were looking for surgeons to go out and train them. And this was, different to other opportunities because it was an opportunity to go and live in the country. So actually, when I finished my training, I went and I worked for 6 months in Cambodia. There'd been one surgeon before me, but I went out to Cambodia and trained these surgeons. Now, by then, I decided that the academic career was something I wanted because I really enjoyed my PhD. What I enjoyed most was the freedom to think, the freedom to do something different, and the other thing I really enjoyed was meeting really interesting people who are all thinking at the cutting edge of various things and learning from them, and speaking with them. So that was something I wanted to do. And so I realized that this was also a passion of mine, this dealing with disease, the complete opposite end, if you like, of the molecular structures. But this was something I also wanted to move into. And so rather than just training these surgeons, we decided to put a scientific slant on this as well and published a paper about the learning outcomes. And that included both qualitative data, so actually interviewing them, and quantitative data on some measures of surgical outcomes. And so that, although, hey, by scientific standards, you may say this is not cutting edge science, actually, it's still, I think, the only paper that's really, at that time, that looked at outcomes from a training program in a low resource setting. So I'd moved into an area where people were not working, and I tried to take a scientific approach to it. And although it's not perfect, it is still arguably some of the best evidence we have out there. And again, that led to me being asked to provide a review paper on training. This was for the WHO bulletin on training, how to train hearing in ear and hearing care. So again, it's that transition from actually doing something that's as scientifically robust as you can to becoming a review area. And again, in this review area, I highlighted some areas where we don't have a lot of good research and what the future research opportunities might be. Again, a springboard for your next grant application because you've identified the knowledge gaps. Moving from that, I would say again, I seized an opportunity where I was wanting to move into the global ear and hearing care space. And so actually, whilst I was in Cambodia, I felt I developed some credentials in global ear disease. I wrote to the World Health Organization and asked them if they needed any support or help with any of their programs, because I was aware that they had a program quite early at that time in ear and hearing care. And obviously by that stage, I had both the clinical acumen and some scientific acumen that they saw some value in this. And it was also opportune because they were revising the ear and hearing care manual. And this was how to train community health workers, workers who work in communities in these low resource settings to manage and look at ear disease, because we don't have ENT surgeons. In fact, many countries have none at all, and some have just a handful. For example, in Malawi, there are probably 2 ear surgeons for the entire country. In Zambia, there are 3 that I know of. So we've got a huge resource gap, and the idea was let's train other health workers to develop this capacity. So again, it was opportune, perhaps also by being proactive and reaching out to people. I got involved I was the lead co-author for this training manual, and through that, they also wanted to undertake evaluation of this training manual in several countries. And so I got the opportunity to link up with people working, first of all, in Uganda, then in Zambia, both obviously in sub-Saharan Africa, and then in Fiji as well. These were countries where there was people interested in ear and hearing care in remote communities. But also, again, I took a scientific approach to this. What I found is that there was very little evidence that this community health worker model actually works. And so, although I was working with the World Health Organization, I decided maybe we should be critical of this approach. And again, as long as you're respectfully critical, people are actually open to that idea and they value that idea. So we did a systematic review of community health workers in addressing ear and hearing disease, and we found that there was actually very little evidence in that area to say that this was a good model. And we tried to fill some of that knowledge gap. Again, through chance, someone was coming along who was wanting to do a PhD in the area of community health workers, and I managed to link up with him, and he actually ended up doing his PhD on training community health workers in the delivery of hearing care in Uganda. We found that there was limited evidence that this is a scalable solution. that you can actually train lots and lots of community health workers to have the expertise required to actually manage all of that. And there is still big debate about this. Do we train health workers who are non-experts but are widespread, or do we train specialists who have the depth of knowledge, but we haven't got as many of them? And yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but there's actually a national meeting in the UK in a couple of months where we will be debating this exact question. On the basis of this, again, through fortune, but also by, linking up with people. After I was in Cambodia, I actually went to Australia for a fellowship. Whilst I was in Australia, I linked up with some of the researchers there. The original link with Australia was because during my PhD, there was a big group in Australia. So again, it was just through serendipity, contacts, and I think also, but just being scientifically robust, that people value what you do. And there at the University of Western Australia, I linked up with someone who was about to do a series of reviews of how to manage the ear discharge in chronic suppurative otitis media. And so again, it all seemed to link up because there was a systematic review method, something called the Cochrane method, which actually collates all of the evidence in the world literature on trials, brings it all together, and that evidence centre Cochrane happened to be based in Oxford for ENT. Where of course I had previous history, so I knew the people in Oxford, and now I knew the people in Western Australia, and so it seemed to all come together where I end up being the clinical lead for these reviews. And again, what we do with these systematic reviews is find what is the current evidence and what is the knowledge gap. And again, identifying that knowledge gap is then the basis for saying, hey, perhaps I'll put in a research grant to try and fill that knowledge gap. And that's kind of where I've ended up now. On the back of that, I was also asked again to write a review paper because you develop the expertise in this area. And so a couple of years ago, I wrote a paper for The Lancet, which is obviously a good journal on chronic suppurative otitis media. And I was fortuitous because I'd also understood some of the molecular science all the way through to models of service delivery that we wrote that paper. But again, in that paper, I put in some knowledge gaps. What are we missing? What do we not know? And you use that to get some funding. So I'm glad to say that as of last year, I did exactly that. We said, hey, there's some big knowledge gaps in the management of chronic suppurative otitis media. We've got these trials, our Cochrane reviews have shown all of this, but actually this is what we're missing. What we don't understand is how to manage this disorder medically in low resource settings. And so I got a £3 million, well, that's about $4 million grant to actually develop trials in low resource settings. So this is funded by the National Institute for Health Research. I'm supervising 2 PhDs in Zambia. Zambia, again, was that link through the work that I'd done on training or trialing the community health worker program in Zambia. So again, it's all just links with people that I know and people who are my friends, of course. And so we're doing a trial of iodine, simple treatment, washout of ears across, 4 to 5 communities in Zambia, Malawi. This is self-medication with iodine because we do know that they don't have access to antibiotics and can't afford the antibiotics. So what we're trying to see is if this low-cost solution with iodine will work. We're also looking at low-cost hearing aids, something called bone conduction. We can send the sound via the bone. We have a low-cost version that we can produce for around $50. We can probably get it lower than that, and we're looking at potential solutions for that as well. So these are trials that are going to start this year, recruiting again several hundred people across these areas. So that's kind of where I've ended up, starting from molecular science all the way through to clinical trials in low and middle income countries. And actually, it's been a web of people and opportunities. So I guess if I was to generalize what I have learned through my career, I would say seize opportunities and seize people. I mean, it can sometimes be difficult to understand what those opportunities are, but when you see something, you think, oh, that's interesting. Try and go for it. And I think the most important thing is actually people. If there are people that you want to interact with, find the right person who's got the expertise, but also the personality that you want to work with. I'm very lucky in the research world. I can choose who I work with, whereas you can't always choose who you work with clinically. But in the research world, I choose who I work with because I don't have to work with everybody, and I work with some really good people that I respect and that I enjoy the company of. I think you need to be scientifically robust. So, as I've sort of suggested, a good thing to do is when you enter into a sphere, be critical of what's already been done, be respectful and be scientific in your approach, of course, but people will value that because we are all scientists, and so we should be critical. Be scientifically robust, so therefore, when you produce a paper, trying to be as strong as possible as you can. And I've dabbled in quantitative and qualitative. And when I say dabbled, what that means is I've gone and found someone who actually knows much more than I do. You should never be afraid of asking people. I'm happy with what I know. I'm happy with what I don't know. And I'm happy to ask people who know a lot more about these things than I do, because it's better to be robust than try and feign knowledge. And I would say you need both breadth and depth of inquiry. Breadth, of course, to understand the variety of things that you might influence your thought processes, because you don't want to be a one-trick pony either, as we would call it, because, hey, maybe you don't get that grant, there's opportunities elsewhere, but you also need depth because actually, if you're going to be an expert in one area and really do something scientifically robust and the thing that you choose to investigate, you do want depth to that. And then finally, do what interests you. It's quite difficult to motivate yourself if it's not something that you're really into, and I try and enjoy it. I think, hopefully, for most of us, it doesn't always feel like it when you're sitting there with your pipette. Science is fun, it can be interesting, and it is great opportunities. You have freedom of thought that you don't get in many other jobs. It can be tough at times, but it is actually a great privilege to have the ability to investigate things and to use your mind for all these other things. Thank you for your time.
That was awesome. I really enjoyed that, Moon. Any questions specifically for Mood before we transition into panel discussion? And we'll probably have another 10 to 15 minutes of discussion, hopefully. I don't see any hands or anything in the chat. And Tanya sends her congratulations to you, Mood. All right, then. So maybe we'll, somebody for admission. All right. Maybe we'll just start with a basic question regarding chronic suppurative otitis media. Globally or within the United States, we all know it's still a great problem clinically. Aside from iodine, I know Peter mentioned something about other treatments. What do you see in the offing in the next 5 to 10 years that can be changed in terms of protocols for treatment and surgical, whether surgical or medical, for chronic suppurative otitis media?
Yeah, actually, one of the biggest talks that we give at the Academy every year is to general ENTs, and it's trying to educate them around the use of topical treatments. So I think that's one of the biggest changes. It's very hard to change practice in the community. So we try to educate general ENTs about the persister cells and biofilms, and what really they're only going to use what they have at their disposal, which is topical fluoroquinolones and the antiseptics. So what we try to do is try to teach them what mechanisms of action they all have and what are the effects of them. And we really try to get them to stop using topical fluoroquinolones because of what I kind of alluded to in terms of causing more harm than good in the long run, like developing antimicrobial resistance in the ear, whereas the antiseptics don't. They just either kill it or don't. But there's some nuances there. So sometimes the topical fluoroquinolones are very effective in getting that inactivity at first. They kill the bugs very quickly, but you have to substitute that with some antiseptics. I think in the immediate future, in the next couple of years, it's really trying to change practice away from really understanding what they have at their disposal and trying to avoid using topical fluoroquinolones in the majority of situations. Beyond that, I'm hoping, and it's probably a longer play than 5 to 10 years because drug development takes so long, is we're doing some in vivo studies at the moment looking at nanomedicines to kill persistent cells. And I really think that that's kind of the next wave of therapeutics that are going to come out against antimicrobials. Unfortunately, there's a lot of new antimicrobials that are being developed, but the history of antimicrobials really means that they end up being really good preclinically, but they really end up being on the shelf clinically because people are afraid to use them because they're kind of the last line of resistance. So we're trying to develop things that can be used in the first instance. That wouldn't be necessarily last line of resistance, but developing predominantly at targeting the persistent cells rather than at the metabolic cells, which is what antimicrobials tend to do.
I guess at the other end, we know that around 3 to 4% of the world population has chronic suppurative otitis media, and we've just done an epidemiological review a few months ago. We estimate there's 300 million in the world living with this, 85% of whom live in low and middle income countries. So they're not going to be able to afford any of these new treatments. They can't even afford the antibiotics at the moment. So the questions that we go forward with, and what's surprising is when you do a review paper, you find how little there is written about this disorder that affects so many in low middle income countries, and there's just very little research into it. So I think for me going forward, we need to find out, does iodine work? Anecdotally, it does. If it does it lead to long-term resolution of discharge, and does it lead to healing of the tympanic membrane? I imagine the answer is no. And so then we at least have an answer to say, hey, maybe it stops the ear discharge. We still need lots of surgeons, possibly, to fix this hole. Or we say, we can manage this disorder by repeatedly giving topical iodine, and that's an acceptable solution. Equally, if iodine doesn't work, what is not happening now is that topical antibiotics, if that is what we decide is the best treatment, and certainly our Cochrane reviews suggested it's probably at the moment the best treatment, why is that not on the WHO formally of essential medications? You've got a disorder that affects 300 million around the world, and it's not an essential medication on the WHO list. So we need to make the argument for that. And unfortunately, at the moment, we don't have strong enough evidence to make that argument. But I'm hoping that, obviously in about a few years' time, we will do. Equally, if none of these treatments actually lead to healing of the tympanic membrane, and if our patients actually want a long-term dry ear, which is a question we're also asking, we're doing some qualitative work with the community members to ask them what they're actually looking for treatment. If they say, oh, I'm happy if my ear just stops discharging, or if they say, no, I want my ear to be dry forever, which is what we think, then it makes an argument that we need to develop more and more of the surgical capacity. And also, if we know that these treatments don't lead to long-term resolution of ear discharge, it means that we should stop perhaps investing in this community-based model, and we should actually invest more and more in developing that expertise alongside, ideally, of course, public health measures, which would stop the disease happening in the first place. But possibly that's outside of the remit of an ENT surgeon.
I did notice when you talked about your clinical trial mood that one of your pictures you were also testing hearing. So I suppose that's also to check for ototoxicity for povidone iodine.
Yeah, we'll check for ototoxicity both for hearing, tinnitus, and dizziness. Yeah.
And so far, do you have preliminary results on that for your trials?
We don't have preliminary results. We have evidence from other trials that it seems to suggest, certainly from the Cochrane review, that the risk is very, very low. There's some animal data that suggests that iodine can be toxic at high concentrations, probably not at the sort of concentration that we use. But I even use iodine to wash all my ears during surgery because I just wash out whatever bacteria might be in there in biofilms or planktonic state in a chronically inflamed ear. And I anecdotally have not had any problems doing that.
Yeah. That might be similar to what you had, Peter, in Perth, right? When you were also administering iodine.
Yeah, we should just tell the nurses they would give them syringes and they would just flush the ears out. I mean, I certainly use a lot of iodine in the OR and things like that. Interestingly, our animal research showed that if you you gave it with a detergent, it seemed to be more toxic than if you didn't. And so in when we do ototoxicity studies now for other things in the lab, we actually have iodine with detergent as our positive control. So we know that itself is toxic, but without detergent, it seemed to be safe in the mouse. That comes with the caveat that I think the mouse's sensitivity is a lot different than the human sensitivity. But interestingly, what the formulation is with the iodine seems to matter.
And both of you just talked about antimicrobials, developing new ones, and maybe being selective with the old ones that are available. Would you advocate then for any setting, whether low income or high income, that additional methods for diagnostics are used, whether sequence-based, PCR, etc.? This is for bacterial detection.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's research questions and there's clinical questions. I mean, I suppose, it depends on what you're talking about. In sub-Saharan Africa, where people haven't got clean water, I think the idea of bringing in sequencing for everything clinically will just be unrealistic. I think what I'm more interested in is the idea that actually, if you've got thick stuff coming out of your ear, you've got a perforated eardrum. I mean, I can often diagnose perforated eardrums just from, the clinical picture. If you've got pus coming out of your ear, you've got a hole in your eardrum. I know that before I've even looked in your ear. So that would be the idea: is if we've got pus coming out of an eardrum, can we just treat empirically without culture or sequencing based bacteriology, and only for treatment failure would we actually look into it. So that's actually something we're looking at as well as part of the trial. We're actually taking swabs as a research question of many of the ears, and then we're looking at those that fail treatment to see if there's any particular markers that would lead you to be more likely to fail. And that relates not only to the bacteriological or fungal characteristics of the discharge, but also to the patient characteristics. And maybe there's some, if you've had a discharging ear continuously for 5 years, which we do see, someone who's just got pus coming out of their ear continuously, that's a very different disease to someone who says, "Oh, my ear weeps a little bit for a few days every 8 months," or something like that. So again, we need to classify the disease in different ways. And again, if we do get a treatment outcome, is it the right thing for everybody, or do we need to sort of grade the disease and say, look, this is likely to work for this group, but if you've got long-standing disease, maybe you just need to go straight for surgical repair or something else.
I sort of second what Mood said. I think clinically at the moment we only have a hammer, and so it doesn't really matter what they're growing. So, however, I'm highly interested from a research point of view because I think it is going to change things in the future. So I think in low settings, low resource settings, I don't think we need to. In high risk settings, I think you need to be doing it only if you're associated with the research in that. You know, we kind of wrote this paper about showing it didn't really matter what you cultured in chronic suppurative otitis media. It didn't affect the treatment outcome anyway. But when we that bank that we worked on with 150 isolates, if you looked at what we cultured, it was very different than what we sequenced. It gave us very different information. And so I think as long as people realize that, I think that's the matter, is that don't rely on a culture or a sequence to determine how they clinically treat someone. It's really, as Mood said, you can see it with your eyes, what they need. But I think from a research point of view, I think there's a lot of things that are going to be developed in the future where I think doing the research and sequencing the bacteria is going to be very important.
Again, I've been fielding questions, but if there are questions from the audience, please go ahead and chime in. Anybody? From our mentees? Oh, Sharon, you unmuted.
The last one, because you mentioned that you saw with the iodine one particularly ototoxic when you mixed it with the detergent as well. Did you not see that with just the detergent itself? I know I've accidentally done this and not end well.
Yeah, no, we didn't actually have a detergent arm. Maybe we should have, but we had, because it was really reflecting what people use clinically, and you know, as Mood says, often like we'll wash the ear with iodine as a surgical prep. And surgical prep can come as straight iodine, or it can come with detergent. And so we really wanted to advise clinicians that, what you should and shouldn't be doing. I'd be interested though to see. I mean, I hadn't thought of detergent itself being ototoxicity. I've kind of thought of it as a permealizer for the iodine, but interesting to hear what you thought and you've seen with detergents being ototoxic.
I mean, I haven't done it with ear cells, but I've done it with immune cells, and we accidentally had some detergent mixed in with one of our proteins, and it killed all of our immune cells in that culture. So it can be depending. It depends on detergent as well, but yeah, some of them can be quite toxic to cells, so could be a contributing factor. It might not have been iodine then itself.
Other questions? I mean, Peter and Moon, maybe you have questions to each other. You can also ask each other if you want.
I mean, we're all
right.
linked by Western Australia, it seems. And I'm sad that I didn't wasn't there at the time he was. It would have been great to hang out directly, and he did a lot of great work with Chris and things like that. I'm really impressed by the epidemiological work, and I really think that's what I think. As we all sit here and we're all like putting in grants and things like that for otitis media, and then they get rejected, we're all like upset, and so part of that is I think a lot of people that need to know don't really appreciate the burden of disease of that. And, sure, there's World Health Organization reports, and, when we were writing, we pretty much have done the only epidemiological research done in the US to describe the burden. And it was really not a great paper. It was just based on very limited information that we had on the insurance data. But, I kind of just want to thank all the epidemiological work that's done, because I think that is something that is still an area of great need, because it undermines why we're not getting as much traction as we need to for funding in this area of research.
All right. Well, we're now at 9 a.m. Thank you so much for everybody who stayed on. Again, this will be posted on the COMMeND website. So Landon will alert everyone when that's there. So for your friends who are not here, I hope that you can spread the word. This is one of the more informative webinars. Every webinar is great, but I really enjoyed this one because CSOM is also close to my heart. I hope everybody has a great 2026. Thanks for joining in, and hope to see you at the next webinar. Thanks, Mood and Peter.
Thanks, Reggie.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Reggie. Bye.